The Late Great Planet Earth, Chapter 9. The spirit that I have seen may be a devil, and the devil hath power to assume a pleasing shape. Hamlet. Chapter 9. The Future Führer. A dictator? Who is a dictator? What makes a dictator? A dictator is a person with absolute authority, a person who has power over people. Does he appear suddenly on the scene and say, "Stop this outmoded democratic process. I am your leader now"? That isn't the way it happens. A dictator does not thrust his rule upon people from the top down without provocation. His tyranny is the end result of chaos in the society that results in his rise to despotic power. The dictionary describes him as a person who seizes the authority over a nation as the result of an emergency. The chicken and egg principle does not apply here. A troubled society produces the atmosphere for the rise of a dictator. It is not the dictator who initiates the conditions to which account for his rise. The conditions which account for his rise. However, once established as the big cheese, history has shown that the dictator cannot find lasting solutions to the problems. The power-mad leader of the Third Reich, Adolf Hitler, would not have achieved his terrifying control over the lives of millions if the times had not been ripe for him. In the 1930s, the German people were in despair. Economic depression was shaking the foundations of industry. Millions were out of work. Small business enterprises were collapsing. It was a desperate time with desperate people looking for a way out. Hitler, with his evil genius, knew the mood of the German people. He saw the opportunity to pursue his putsch in precisely the era that history demanded. Hitler saw himself as a hero, a savior, a strong man needed by weak underlings, a great leader who could guide the Germans to heights of glory, according to his standards. He believed he was above the moral standards of shady characters of every type. As long as they were useful to him, this motley bunch of criminals and sadists were part of the ruling strength of Hitler's inner circle. When in Rome, Hitler took the name for his empire from the all-powerful First Reich, which was the Holy Roman Empire. It was in Rome that the Caesars introduced universal Caesar worship. Their dictatorial powers also were absolute. A Scottish Bible scholar has written, "The extraordinary fact is that emperor worship was not imposed on the Roman Empire from above. It grew from below." Shades of Hitler. However, there were differences between Hitler allegiance and emperor worship. Hitler's rise to power was rapid in comparison. Emperor worship was a gradual development which grew out of the gratitude of the provincials for what Rome had done for them. When Rome took over a country and unpredictable tyrants were booted out, Roman justice was established. The Roman peace, Pax Romana, was unlike anything the world had seen, and people were deeply grateful. It was not enough for the populace to appreciate Rome. This was an impersonal thing. The spirit of Rome needed to be personalized. The emperor of Rome began to be regarded as divine. Before Christ was born, Caesar was worshipped. The first temple to be erected to the godhead of the emperor was built in Pergamum in 29 BC. Caesar worship had begun. Can you imagine what happened in Rome? The empire was vast. It had many races and languages. It needed a unifying principle, and religion can be a very unifying influence. Soon every Roman citizen was compelled to burn a pinch of incense and say, "Caesar is Lord." Is it any wonder that Caesar worship ran head-on into Christianity? When the Christians refused to call Caesar their Lord, they were subjected to inhumane persecution. The gigantic movie epics showing the lions in the arena with the Christians and the public killings for the gory amusement of the Roman pagan leaders are not conjured from the imaginations of Hollywood producers. There are many seeds which are planted in the breeding grounds for dictators. Anarchy, lawlessness, moral decadence, human desperation, and false hero worship fertilize the fields that produce despots. All the gold carrot and two-bit demagogues of history grew out of the soil of the times. Where do we fit in? Are we living in a peaceful, placid era when people enjoy an environment free of tensions? Ridiculous question to ask, isn't it? But when we slow down our daily lives long enough to take a hard, realistic look at the generation we live in, it's a real shocker. There are many shoulder shruggers who say, always been crime and wars, always will be. Why get all hot and bothered about what's going on today? A short time ago, we saw a graph in a news magazine which indicated the climb in serious crimes in the United States from 1960 to 1968. If you had been an ant on that page, you would have had a very steep stairways to climb each one of those 8 years. While the number of crimes in America was increasing 122%, the population rose only 11%. Many people have stopped talking about the crime rate. They now refer to the crime epidemic. Crime is waged on a grand scale by nations. Since World War II, the world has been embroiled in conflicts that seem to grow increasingly vicious. There has been a rebirth of guerrilla warfare. Revolutions and revolutionary movements are becoming a way of life during this latter part of the 20th century. War and more war. Has there ever been a time when the potential for self-destruction was as great as it is today? Another boom. Some people feel that the concern about the population explosion is exaggerated. They point out that the marvelous technological advances of science will overcome the burgeoning boom in human beings on this earth. They may be right. However, many experts who have studied and evaluated the population growth have arrived at statistics and conclusions which are rather awesome, to say the least. A 1969 report from the United Nations National Policy Panel on World Population claimed that the population crisis is the world's concern and that it is as important as peace itself. The report projects the world population will reach 7.5 billion by the year 2000. Since the number of human beings on Earth in 1968 was 3.4 billion, we see that if the estimate is correct, there will be more than twice as many people in the world 30 years from now. The same report said high fertility and high rates of population contribute to pollution, congestion, urban sprawl, and a host of psychological ailments in developed countries that might mean widespread famine, increased illiteracy, unemployment, squalor, and unrest, threatening the foundations of public order in developing countries. Chairman of the Genetics Department at Ohio State University, J. Bruce Griffin, is quoted as saying that unless mankind acts immediately, there will be a worldwide famine in 1985 and the extinction of man within 75 years. We may not think this will affect us personally, but in 1967, Dr. Stanley F. Yalls, director of the National Institute of Mental Health, said, "Population movement and the increased pressures of a speeded-up society undoubtedly are causing an increasing amount of emotional disturbance. Between 1960 and 1965, the number of U.S. psychiatrists, psychologists, and other mental health workers rose 44%. Youngsters are being admitted to mental hospitals in numbers 7 times their share of the total population. Many of those left on the outside proclaim loudly their alienation from society. If we complain about not being able to find breathing space or resent being squeezed into an impersonal, computerized society, imagine what it might be like 30 years from now if we're still around. Men who are studying population biology, such as Paul Ehrlich, professor at Stanford University, and expert in this field are inclined to be doomsters because of the research they've done. Ehrlich, for instance, says, mankind may be facing its final crisis. No action we can take at this late date can prevent a great deal of future misery from starvation and environmental deterioration. All systems go. It doesn't take a religious person to discern the fact that what is happening is setting the world in the proper frame for a dictator. We see anarchy growing in every country. We see established standards of morality thrown aside for a hedonistic brand, which is attractively labeled the new morality. We see the superweapons and threats of atheistic leaders in world powers who would not hesitate to use those weapons if they would further their drive for conquest. A view seems to be creeping into the consciousness of concerned people that the problems and the tensions of the world need to be controlled by a strong hand from someplace. Even Arnold Toynbee, the eminent historian, said on a radio broadcast that by forcing on mankind more and more lethal weapons, and at the same time making the world more and more interdependent economically, technology has brought mankind to such a degree of distress that we are ripe for the deifying of any new Caesar who might succeed in giving the world unity and peace. Who is the future Führer? The time is ripe, and it's getting riper for the great dictator, the one we call the future Führer. This is the one who is predicted in the scriptures very clearly and called the Antichrist. The Bible gives a perfect biographical sketch of this future world leader. If you will follow the scripture from Revelation without being bothered by the figures of speech which are used, you will see that the Bible explains the meaning. And he stood on the sand of the seashore. And I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads. And on his horns were 10 diadems, and on his head were blasphemous names. And the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like those of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his throne and great authority. Revelation 13:1. You may be saying that this doesn't sound like a human being to you, but just press on and follow carefully how the mystery unfolds. Revelation continues with this description. And I saw one of his heads as if it had been slain. Mark carefully the as if in the phrase above. And his fatal wound was healed. And the whole earth was amazed and followed after the beast. And they worshipped the dragon, because he gave his authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, who is like the beast, and who is able to wage war with him? Revelation 13:3. This person, the Antichrist, is called the beast because from God's viewpoint, that is exactly what he is. The passage is obviously talking about a person because the personal pronoun he is used. It is also described as a person of great authority. In the 17th chapter of Revelation, we are given the meaning of this description and the beast coming out of the sea. Revelation 17:15 says, And he said to me, The waters which you saw, where the harlot sits, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. The harlot refers to the religious system which will be tied in with this dictator. This will be described in more detail in the next chapter. When it says that the beast will emerge out of the sea, it means that he will come out of the chaos of the nations. In the Old Testament, Isaiah speaks of the chaos of the nations that is to come, and says there is no peace for the wicked. They are like the troubled sea, which is a symbolic picture of the Gentile nations. Isaiah 57:20.